So my name is Khadijah Ibrahiim. I'm a poet and a multidisciplinary artist, which means I work in theatre, I create events, I work with textiles, and I do a range of other activities. I'd like to describe myself as a literary activist more than anything. I was born in Leeds. Like to say, I'm a Leeds lass, a Yorkshire lass. In actual fact, as a writer, I was described as a Yorkshire Jamaican writer, and I like the title. Growing up in Leeds was quite interesting, um, in the sense that I grew up in the 70s, and I grew up in a household that was very rich in culture, Jamaican culture. Food was always being cooked on the stove. There was always music playing in the front room. It was a very active home. It wasn't a home that was close to anybody. So my mother's door was always open. My mother was always cooking, and people would always come by for something to eat. And I just thought, Mum's got a lot of friends. But what I realised in the early days is that my mother would cook for a living, and people would come to the house and get something to eat. And that's why the house was always busy. And there were friends as well, and people that probably didn't have any family. And there was always a lot of men coming through to get their hard food, their Saturday soup, their fish on a Friday. So it was a house that always smelled of food, and we were fed very, very well. I think my mother showed love to us through food more than anything, and her love for music and caring for people. And that was a really important aspect of my mother's life. She's still with us. She was born 1940, so she just recently turned 84, and I feel very blessed that my mother, Gloria St. Augustine McLaren, also I like to call her Flo Glow, is still with us. And glow because she's always glowing, not just because her name's Gloria, but she's always got a smile, and she's such a great storyteller. And she's someone that once she opens her mouth, there's always a story to tell, and she'll hold you in that story. And I wrote a poem about her called her Dutch Pot of Stories, because when she's talking, she feels like she's spinning you around, like she would do dumplings, kneading dumplings. And I describe her with food because food is the thing that she did more importantly for us. And so in her storytelling, we'd always get a sense of what Jamaica was like. And Jamaica felt like home for us in that house, in the area that we grew up in. But I was also very fortunate to have my grandparents as well, and both of them, were activists. Both my mother and my grandmother, which my grandmother's my father's mother, they both worked as carers, as nurses. My grandmother in the accident and emergency at the LGI, and she was head of her ward. So I think at that time she would have been called a sister or matron or something like that. Not sure of her position, but I know she ran that department, and it was the accident and emergency. But she worked her way up into that job over the years. My mother worked as a nurse, as a carer first, then a nurse, and then eventually she went into work in mental health. And I didn't inquire too much about it, but because she was such a great storyteller, you'd hear a story about what happened that day in the hospital. And I know she worked at several hospitals, but the ones that stay with me the most is St James's Hospital, because it's one of the biggest teaching hospitals in Europe, and that's where everybody would go. We call it Jimmy's. And so my mum would always say, be careful, don't have an accident. I'm saying it nicely, but if she was wheeling in patois, it'd be something like, Minagua Jimmy's for you, right? So in other words, I'm not going to take you to St James's because I work there every day, and I want to be taking my children there as well. And the other place was Meanwood Park Hospital. Um, at that point, Meanwood Park Hospital, I'm not even sure if they would call it a mental health hospital, because that's not the terminology that was used. But Meanwood Park Hospital was something around care for people that were institutionalized. They were not leaving that place; they were there for life, and it has such an interesting history. But I just want to go first to Meanwood Park, because I think that's where Mum might have started first, before St James's. And Meanwood Park Hospital had a reputation of, in its early days, I guess 60s or 70s, I'm not quite sure, was a place for people would send unwed mothers there, not because they were ill, it's because of the shame that they were unwed and they were having babies, and they'd take away the child and they'd send the mother there, and they wouldn't actually leave. So they were institutionalized. And I say this because these are the stories that my mother would be telling me, that she'd be working there and there'll be somebody that was in there for maybe 30, 40 years, and they're old now, and they've developed some kind of mental health problem because they've been in there so long. And I think what I learnt from my mother is that taking care of people that have mental health problems is not an easy task. There was a few times mum would come home with black eyes, yeah, or because the person has had an outburst, and she would never take it personally or anything like that. She was caring for, as a black woman, she was caring for a lot of white people, and so sometimes the racist remarks would come out, and yet my mum would go back. And for me, listening to that, I'd think, why would she go back? Why would she do something different? But I think she totally understood the condition of the people, and she had a real understanding of what mental health was, what it entailed, and how to be a carer and not to take things personally. She then moved to St James's, and and that's where she would say to us, "Oh, it's such a shame because here now, this is where I'm seeing people that look like me, black people, Caribbean people." But she'd use the terminology West Indian people, and sometimes it was people that we knew, you know. And the only reason why we knew that, not because she would be disclosing any of that information, is this was a temporary place, so you'd be admitted for a period of time, and then they would release you back into the community. The I explained that I was born in Leeds, and I grew up first in an area called Hare Hills, and then we moved to Lovell Park. But I spent a lot of time in Chapeltown because my grandparents lived in Chapeltown. At my grandparents' home, I'd stayed there a lot, by the way. I wanted to say that. And there would be this thing where you couldn't really go outside. My grandparents were very old school, sit down and read a book and help grandma, help granddad, and do something in the house. And it was always that was also a very, very big house, very busy house because they were activists. And I mean real activists, not just people that talked about doing things. They organised protests and marches, and they would do things, and that was the hub where people would go to that house. And once again, when you're a child, you just think these people know a lot of people, and the house is always busy, and it was a house of love. Um, so I stayed in that house. I didn't really know people in the Chapeltown community very well. But as I got older and I would come into Chapeltown, and I got to know more people, it started to make a bit more sense when Mum would say there were people from the community in there, in the hospital, and then people would say, "Oh, I saw your mum. I wasn't well, and it was really good to see your mum. She took care of me." And so you started to make the connections that this person had mental health problems. Um, and they were so happy to see someone that they could connect with. I've got five brothers and sisters, so I'm the second to last, and so my older brothers and sisters, there will be people their age, especially my older brother, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm Andrew's friend," and they were not afraid to say this is where they were, because they were happy to see somebody that looked like them. It was mum, and caring for them, but also they'd say, "I'm out, but I'll be back again." And this has kind of continued over the years, even though mum has retired. Over the years, in this community, you might still see people and they say, "I remember your mum. I remember her." They remember her from the hospital, especially some of the Caribbean women that also worked there in different capacities. Sometimes with the men, they would say, "Oh, your mum looked after my son," or "Your mum took care of me," or "We was at your house eating food," or "Your mum would cook the food for this club," and and she would. I remember mum cooking. I don't know how she would do these jobs, but you worked several jobs back then. especially if you're taking care of children. My father had left. He went to America to do his studies, and my father became a professor in chemistry and physics, and that's where he stayed, and that was what he wanted to do. And mum was home, and so I had this back and forth of going to America when I was quite young. And as I mentioned, my father, the grandmother that lived in Leeds and that was responsible for partly raising me, that's my father's mother. So there was all this talk around care and activism and and the importance of taking care of community. So that's how I grew up. And so people know my family quite well, and both my grandparents and my mother quite well. And so when people say, "Oh, everybody knows you, Khadijah, in Leeds," it's because of them and then because of the work that I do. It's quite interesting, my journey into the arts. I always think that as much as my grandparents' home was a strict home, it was a home of interaction. So the people that were activists they had all different kinds of backgrounds, they had jobs and things. And my grandfather became quite ill when I was young with MS, and it meant that he suffered a disability and he couldn't really be as active as he wanted to be. But he used to sing all these folk songs. So mum would play records and tell stories. Granddad would play music, mainly classical music, and sing folk songs and play games. And my grandmother would sew. So as much as she was a nurse and she was an activist, she would also sew. And I think my journey into the arts came through my grandmother saved a building called Studley Grange along with this lady called Mrs. Davis, and they turned that into the first pre-black school. And at the back of that building was a small community centre as well, and they ran the building together. And that the community centre was for the young people. They'd come in and play sound system. And as a child, I'd go to that building, and Grandma would open up the building in the evening, and in the daytime, I went there when it was a nursery. So I think my journey into the arts was first it was sewing, because I'd sit and sew with my grandmother, and I'd hand sew, and then she showed me how to use the machine. And my mother sent my sister and I to tap and ballet class. But then I also went to a school of performing arts. In the 70s and 80s, we still had middle schools in Leeds. So you went to three schools. You went to a primary school, middle school, and a high school. And so my middle school was a regular middle school, but the teacher in there, the PE teacher, had a love for contemporary dance. So we do part PE and we do part contemporary dance. And then we'd put on these big productions that would not just show in the school, but they'd go to the Grand Theatre. And if you was lucky enough, you'd go abroad and you'd be doing all this contemporary dance, and she'd steer you towards a school of performing arts, which was Intake High. And that's where I went. So my love for dance and drama and theatre and drawing, and I could draw. There was all these elements to me. So when it was time for me to leave school, and my grandparents kept saying, "What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do?" In fact, before leaving school, they was going, "What are you gonna do?" And some of my cousins had really intelligent answers about what they wanted to do, and it was always in the medical field. And there I was thinking, I want to draw and I want to dance, but I don't know the language as a job for that. And I didn't know how to explain it. So I said, "Oh, I want to do law." I didn't want to do law, but it just felt like the thing to say because that would make them smile. And so they started to buy me law books, and I had no interest in this. But my grandmother recognized the artistry in me. And I went off I did A-level arts, and I went off to art school, and I did fashion and textiles. And my grandmother was really pleased about that. And but in the back of my mind was, I really want to dance. I really want to do theatre. And later on, when I went to university, I decided that I really enjoyed literature, because now that get in the house, go sit down and read a book, was now my love for books and reading literature, and really being introduced to literature by this wonderful woman called Palorine, who introduced me to some phenomenal African American women writers, female writers like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks and Zora Neale Hurston, and I was really getting into that reading of that because I'd gone back to do English literature, which is something that I never did at school. I did English language, but not English literature. So I went and I did that, and then I went to university and did Arabic and Middle Eastern studies, which combines language and literature. And then I went to do my master's in theatre studies. So that's really my journey. And the poetry was always something I enjoyed, and I never set out to be a poet at all. It was that I'm going to do theatre and I'm going to combine my love for sewing and fashion and all the skills that I learned at art school, and I'm going to design for theatre and I'm going to write for theatre, and that's where my heart is, and it's still there, by the way, and putting together exhibitions and installations. But nothing was coming my way, and I didn't know how to approach it once I left university. And someone says to me, "Oh, are you a poet?" And I was like, "Oh, I write some poetry," and I got my first commission. Interestingly enough, in my first commission to write and read some poetry at an event at a festival, I wrote the poems, and I got really nervous about reading the poems and performing them, that I asked a friend to come with me. Her name's Marva Buchanan. And I got there and I said, "Marva, go read the poems on the stage." And she says, "No, because it says Khadijah Ibrahiim." I said, "Marva, go read the poems on the stage. I just don't think I can do it." And she went and she read my poems. She says, "I'm reading on behalf of Khadijah Ibrahiim. These are her poems, but I'm reading them." And she read the poems. And then I got another commission. And then I would kind of cloud it with, "Oh, I know these dancers. Come and dance while I do these poems," to this, so it take away from people looking at me. And I said, "Marva, come with me." And then I did it again. And then she said, I'm not doing this again for you. Go and read your poems." And I think what it was for me, it wasn't that I was scared to read the poems. I didn't know the poetic voice. I didn't think that I knew the poetic voice for the poems. And someone said to me, "When you're writing these poems, who do you hear?" I said, "I hear my grandmother, I hear my grandfather, I hear my mother, I hear the storytelling. This is then channel that." And so I think I've spent most of my life channeling grandma, granddad, and my mum in the storytelling and that love of music. So everything that when I'm writing, I write to music, and I hear musicality in my poems, and I want to replicate some of the sounds that I hear in the poetry, and I want to try to experiment with those ideas. And so that's how I fell nicely into poetry. I believe as a literary activist that I really feel that my responsibility as someone that grew up with books and literature and fell in love with it at a later stage, because it felt forced on me at first, and then when I got older there was an appreciation and a love for it. It just opened up a whole new world. So I feel that my duty as a literary activist is to share that and to show people the avenues and take them on that journey until they find their own feet and their own love for literature, because that's how it came to me. And so the work that I do with the young people and adults as well, and I've also worked with people with mental health problems in different ways. I've gone to various organisations in Leeds, is to really promote literature and the beauty of it, and for people to find their own voices and their own sense of knowing and well-being within the writing. And so that's what I try to do. That's what I try to push forward in my work. For the young people, I just felt that I didn't want them to lose themselves in what's happening in the streets. I've got three young people, they're not children. I've got three children and they're all adults. But when they were young, I had a fear, especially two black boys growing up in Chapeltown, growing up in Britain, and knowing what schools were like, knowing what school was like for me. I talked about going to a school of performing arts, but what I didn't mention is that school of performing arts was based in a very white neighbourhood where people would tell you directly that they didn't like you based on the colour of your skin. they would sit next to you in class and talk about how racist they were, but that was not the language that they used. They would say that they belonged to the National Front Party or they were part of the British Movement Party. That was the language of the 80s, British Movement and National Front, or NF. And they'd write it on the desk. That some of the teachers were part of that movement. So sometimes they wouldn't call you by your name. If a child called you outside of your name, they wouldn't get in trouble for it. So the language of racism didn't exist for them. They felt that they had that right. And I hated school for that reason, you know. And then I saw that it was still happening with my children in school, and there was no way of reporting it to anyone. It was always brushed off. And I could see that even if they were not calling them outside of their name, the way that they were teaching my children. So one of the things that I would do is, with my first son, I went into his primary school and said, I can come and help. I can be a helper. And they said, that's great. And I used to help out. And the helping out was, I need to see what you're doing with my child. I also need to see what you're doing with all these other children. And that sparked my interest to go and do my teacher training so I could be more qualified to help out. Not necessarily that I wanted to be a teacher, but that I could say, this is what I have. And then when my daughter was born, I did exactly the same thing in her primary school. But her primary school and the head teacher there seemed like a really beautiful and balanced woman. And my child had no problems in that school, neither her or my youngest son. And the problem started when they got to high school. And my eldest son was already in high school, so I could see what was happening. And I went into their high schools. I was always there. And one teacher said, why are you always here? I said, because I'm helping. And then I figured out, let me not just be a helper, let me get paid for this. And so part of that was setting up Leeds Young Authors. And my son would, and I did exactly what my mother did. Your friends can be in the house, so I know where you are. So my house was the stomping ground. The music would be playing in the attic. My son had all his friends up there. You'd hear all this grind music coming out, yeah. And you feel like the house is falling down, but it's all right, yeah, because that's the sound of laughter and that's the sound of youth, and I'm fine, and that's how I grew up. And my daughter's friends would come, and my youngest son's friends would come, and I liked it all because I knew where they were, and I'd just cook and make sure everybody ate because that's what my mother did, and I realized that's what I was imitating, and that was fine. But Leeds Young Authors came out of really me seeing what was happening to my children, especially my oldest son, and said, if I could actually create a space now, get them out of the house and create a space where these young men could express themselves and introduce poetry, and then they would be happy to say, I'm a poet, because now I know what a poet does. And I know the language of poetry, whereas before I didn't really know the language as a job, as a title. I could give that to them. And that's the starting point. So in 2002, I first introduced the idea of poetry into schools. And then in 2003, I created Leeds Young Authors. But what's happening for us in terms of access to space, it becomes quite difficult. And I often say to people, especially those working in theatre and they want to put on productions and they want to get into a theatre and they don't have access to it, or it's difficult for them. Theatre can be anywhere. In my theatre studies, I studied the work of a man called Augustus Bowell, Theatre of the Oppressed, and he talked about theatre in everyday life, that the conversation that you have in the street, in the workplace, is theatre, because you're always performing. Your boss might say, how are you performing? And I thought, yeah, everything is performance and everything is theatre. Reading the newspaper is theatre. And he talked about open spaces, indoors, outdoors, and not conventional theatre spaces. And so that's what I've always taught young people and adults. And when I'm mentoring and you want to put on a production, well, we might just have the back street for now, and we can do that. Or we might just have a room in a theatre or a room in somebody's office, but we're going to clear it. We might have the salon, but we can turn that into a theatre space. And so that's what I teach a lot of, about access to space in different ways and get people thinking wider, because every space is a liminal space that becomes theatre and performance.